Good morning, and thank you for listening to WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville, Kentucky. This is Artist Talk with LVA, and I'm the host, Keith Waits. And today we have someone new to me, first time on the show, multidisciplinary artist Colleen Merrill's work examines the simultaneously personal and social history of textiles. Her adorned, embellished, and sometimes garish composite forms scrutinize the beauty and tension of our most interdependent relationships. She has exhibited her work here in Kentucky, in Lexington and Louisville, but also around the country in New York, San Francisco, and Pittsburgh, and at the International Textile Biennial at Hacht, Belgium. In Hacht, Belgium. She has received grants from the Kentucky Foundation for Women and the Great Meadows Foundation. She has been awarded fellowships for the Birdcliff Artist Residency in New York and the Pentaculum Textiles Residency at the Aramont School of Arts and Crafts in Tennessee. She is currently an associate professor of art at Bluegrass Community and Technical College and a part-time instructor in fiber and material studies at the University of Kentucky. Her latest body of work, Day In and Day Out, will open at Wheelhouse Art here in Louisville on Saturday, July 16th with a reception from 3 to 5 p.m. So if you think she's interesting in this interview, you have a chance to come meet her. The exhibition will continue through September the 3rd of this year. Colleen Merrill, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me today.
I tried to pare that down. You have a very impressive bio, though. There's a lot of stuff there, a lot of particulars that people should go to your website and they can read all about it. So let's talk about, okay, you have this show, and have you shown in Louisville before?
I have, yeah, I've shown a few places. Zephyr Gallery, which I think recently may have closed. I was really sad to hear, or maybe relocated. I saw that. I was on Market Street not too long ago and saw that they weren't there anymore. And I've shown at the Louisville Visual Arts place. That was probably, over 10 years ago, though. So it's been a while. And then I've shown at the Carnegie, which I feel like can count as Louisville because it's close enough, in New Albany, Indiana, for their quilt show.
Were you at, was this in the Water Tower, or was it when we had the gallery on 2nd Street?
It was Water Tower.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it was when I was in grad school. So it was about a little over 10 years ago. So that was my first show actually to ever have in Louisville. And then I also have had a show at the Green Building Gallery, which again, Daniel, who is the owner at Wheelhouse, was the curator at that time. So a lot of the opportunities I've had in Louisville have been due to sort of Daniel hooking me up with different exhibitions.
Well, shame on me, because Colleen, I probably helped hang your work at the Water Tower.
Well, it's really changed since then. It was definitely still textiles, but it was not the same type of forms that I've been working on lately. So,
well, talk to us about what people will encounter when they come to Wheelhouse. Where is your work now? I've been looking at your images and things like that, and it's both unique and a little bit unusual, but it also, there's ways in which it seems to me like it's expressing a certain kind of trend in textile art right now. It's very colorful, very fun, but also very intellectually driven. You tell me what we're going to encounter.
So a lot of my older works are created from repurposed quilts and deals a lot with this sort of social history of quilting and sewing and textiles in general. And then over time, the works have become a lot more personal, just sort of where they come from. It's not that I'm talking a lot about myself in the work, but the influence behind the work has been much more about my experiences, sort of the day-to-day life of what it is to be a mother, a partner within sort of what we call in America, so-called nuclear family. And the exhibition that's at Wheelhouse is titled Day In and Day Out. And that actually comes from, I have it here, a book that is a children's book that I've been really intrigued with, these sort of narratives behind children's books. Having an 8-year-old daughter, spend a lot of time reading to her about these sort of narratives that we're given at a young age about sort of how we're expected to live our lives, sort of day in and day out. And sort of as we are all experiencing this sort of collective experience of the pandemic and what it means to be living in the world that we are living in today, the work started to sort of turn a lot more inward and a lot more about what it means to be in these different roles and how different relationships are structured. So the works are that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek way of talking about the fact that the works are personal. But it's important to me that they're also objective, open-ended, so that whoever comes to see them can really get it from their own perspective. And that's important to me too. I don't want it, even though the works can have some slight sort of political statements or some social statements, it's important to me that the viewer can come into the work with their own perspective. So the works that you'll expect at Wheelhouse are, half of them are going to be smaller scale works, which is new for me. They're going to be small scale collages that are framed on wood, which is also very new for me. Typically, I do larger scale sculptures that are either sitting in the middle of the floor or hanging up on the wall. So I wanted to play around with something a little bit smaller scale. And they've turned out to be really fun. They're sort of like collages. I mean, that's really how I would describe them. And there's a lot more embellishment than I've ever done before. So lots of detail work, lots of sewing, lots of different like bead work, to different textures and things like that. And then there's also the other half of the works are going to be much more of what I typically do, which are going to be pieces like kind of this little preview of a piece. This is going to be one of the ones in the show that will be hanging on the wall, sort of medium and larger scale pieces that are repurposing different textiles as well. But they're going to be much more organic. They're going to be kind of free flowing. They don't have any sort of frame or structure around them.
Okay. Well, and so I can see from your history, you were doing what you were calling yourself an installation artist. So that's when you talk about like going to a smaller scale, that's sort of where you were coming from, not just that they were a little bit bigger, but that you were doing things that really used space in very specific ways.
Absolutely. And I'm particularly interested in space because the works are created from repurposed textiles. And we tend to associate textiles with the home, right? Of the home. This idea that either, traditionally, if we're creating a quilt, we're creating it for a bed. If we're creating a crocheted work, it might be something that hangs in the home or weaving or something. So I like the domestic connection that textiles brings. And I started to create these sculptures that then could be installed in certain settings that might reflect the home. So for example, I had a show here in Lexington at our Carnegie Center that is in a gallery that it used to be someone's living room. So there was a fireplace and there was this beautiful medallion in the top of the ceiling. And I designed and installed these sculptures very specifically for that domestic space. So I love the parallel that was happening with that. And I'm really interested in continuing on with creating sort of site-specific works that are having that sort of conversation. It's almost like a formal conversation between the space in which the pieces are installed and the pieces themselves, because they do lend themselves to this idea of the domestic sphere. And that's important to me because that's a lot of what the work is about. The work is about sort of what our associations are with the home and what it means to be part of a relationship within the home, what it means to be a parent, a wife, a husband, how we tend to create these sort of narratives of what a family is. And a lot of the works in day out are scrutinizing that, not necessarily in a negative way, but really just sort of pulling it apart. And that's where it comes back to that personal sort of perspective where as a mother of a young child, as a partner, I'm always thinking about, what does it mean to be in this family unit? And what does it mean to be in a home? And how does society at large influence that and sort of dictate or tell us how to live certain ways? So a lot of the smaller scale works allow me also to really focus in on that. So some of the collages and smaller scale pieces, they have sort of hidden references to certain things. They'll take textiles that have, for example, like Little Red Riding Hood is showing up a lot in the pieces. There's a Goldilocks is in one of them. There's a lot of Americana, so different, like an apron that had frozen peas imagery on it that was like really, popular in the sort of 70s and 80s. So I'm wanting to bring in some sort of layers in regards to perceptions of like sort of American culture in the family in the home. So kind of it's coming full circle in that way, but I'm really enjoying playing with these different references that are sort of hidden within the different layers of the pieces.
Well, it's fascinating to hear you talking. You said earlier about nuclear family, you made that reference. And it seems to me like some of your language goes back to like in the 60s when or maybe it was the 50s, but coming out of the middle of the 20th century, there was the birth of demographics and an awareness, and suddenly the whole concept of a nuclear family and all these different I think we started to examine ourselves so much more closely.
Mhm.
And you're touching on a lot of those kinds of things, which I think a lot of that vernacular you don't hear as much now as you used to a little while ago. It seems like you're it's part of what makes you stand out right now to me.
Yeah, and I think that as as much as we want to say we've come a long way in terms of how we have expectations for a family, right? So, not all families are a man and a wife, right? We tend to, when you're in this sort of position of being a mother, when I'm sort of reading these books to my daughter, or I'm hearing what, we had a whole year where she was learning in the home, right? Because of the
Right.
pandemic. So I was listening in what her first grade teacher is teaching her. A lot of our education system and a lot of our popular culture and visual culture still has very traditional reflections of the family. And I found that to be very intriguing with me thinking about just my own personal circumstance within a family and wanting to push back on that a little bit. Because you would think we would be more progressive by now, but as we know, we're dealing with a lot of upheaval in our society right now in terms of how we are sort of dictating what a family looks like. And I just, I'm very intrigued by that. So I sort of see myself as examining these references, and that again parallels with this history of textiles, because textiles are very gendered, right? They're very much of the feminine, or referencing the history of the feminine, and sort of questioning why that is versus like painting. There's a lot of fiber artists who still will not even call their art fiber art. They'll call it painting, because there is these sort of associations within history. And that goes along with our associations of the nuclear family and sort of what we consider that nuclear family to be. So yeah, I don't want to necessarily, say that being in a family is a bad thing, as I am very much in one, but I do want to question our influences and our motivations and our expectations of what it means, to be within that sort of unit and those sort of intimacies that are related to those relationships.
Well, in the nuclear family, just for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what that means, I think it was the old concept was it was a man and a woman and two kids and a dog and a cat, right, and two cars. It's like and
You own a house, like.
I'm extending that a little bit, but it was this very sort of very specific sort of profile
Mhm.
for what the American family was post World War II, I guess. But and that's what I think is so interesting is that we obviously are in a time that where I tell people is like, we took all these things for granted and they're all being rolled back. So it seems like there's a lot of people that want to take us back to something as rigid as that nuclear family description. And so
Yeah.
you're sort of, do you feel like are you rebelling against that in the work you're doing?
Certainly rebelling, pushing back on it, questioning it. The work day in and day out that is going to be at Wheelhouse is inspired by the fact that my daughter was in a play that was it was the different play of the different sort of heroines, right? So it was Goldilocks and it was Little Red Riding Hood, and it was called Into the Woods.
Right.
And sort of the idea is that these heroines, they go into the woods to become domesticated. And this domestication relates to the nuclear family in a way, right? Because it's this idea that you go and you face a danger, like the big bad wolf, and you come out on the other side being this sort of proper woman, sort of coming of age, being fertile, being ready to get married. And as I was sort of researching the folklore behind Into the Woods and all these different narratives, my daughter herself was playing a flower, and it was like a budding flower, which to me I was sort of associating with this idea of fertility and growth, and sort of, so from such a young age she's being shown that you're here for this purpose, and this turns into that. So that's again why I was bringing in that sort of hidden Little Red Riding Hood imagery into the pieces, because to me, like, even it's just so embedded into our stories and into what we learn from such a young age that we don't even necessarily notice it. I never had question Into the Woods or Little Red Riding Hood before. I mean, I knew the story, but I never really thought, oh gosh, like if you really think about it, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, oh, she comes out on the other end being this like perfect woman. I don't know. So yeah, I'm certainly pushing back on it. Trying to question what it means to be in a relationship. Before I had my daughter, a lot of the work also was just about being in a intimate relationship with my partner, and the idea that what do we have expectations for those intimacies? There's a lot of, especially in American culture, there's a lot of pressure on your sort of romantic relationships, whether that be a husband, wife, whatever, and to sort of fulfill everything for you. So that was another sort of topic I was interested in, was exploring the fact that, within a family unit, you shouldn't find all of your happiness, within that nuclear family. You should branch out. You should, consider other relationships. And the pandemic really made that challenging, right? Because you're literally stuck at home with whoever lives in your house. So I think that's why this work kind of grew out of that. It grew out of during that time where I was like not getting that, I was really stuck in the nuclear family because I literally couldn't leave the house. So that's sort of why it was so fresh and was sort of became this like focus for the body of work that is sort of going to be shown.
Well, I think this sounds, I hate to be so generalized about it, but, I think the pandemic probably did force a very personal examination of things for all the creatives I know. It sort of puts you, if you're cut off, you tend to look inward or reflect in a different way. So that it might have even been healthy for artists in that it caused a lot of shifts and a lot of reexamination. They might have been in some ways, not that it was a good, I'm sure you would much rather have been out in the world, but it does have that sort of impact, I think, for a lot of artists. But it was just, and you talk about Into the Woods, just to sort of put this note in there, those sort of, the characters in Into the Woods reached that point of that sort of familiar stereotype, but then it all gets exploded in the second act. I think it's important to make a note about that.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Yeah, no, I have to give them credit for Into the Woods was sort of an ironic way of questioning all of those different narratives. But what I appreciated about it was that it introduced me to re-looking at them and
Right.
rethinking what they are. So yeah, I have to give that literary credit there for sure.
Well, and thinking about things like, and again, I think a lot of people would look at stuff like this and think like, oh, you're getting, that's crazy, or you're going, but you talk about in one of the things I was reading about you talk about, and maybe this was on the Wheelhouse site. I'm not exactly sure which place I found it, but you talk about the importance of Red Riding Hood being red, the cloak being red, and what that means, and her age, which gets interpreted in different ways in different stories. And Into the Woods, she seems to be not the youngest child.
Mm-hmm.
But so when you talk about like stuff like the color red for Red Riding Hood indicating things like menstruation, it's like, I think a lot of people would say, oh, come on, it's a fairy tale, it's a children's story, it's a thing. But of course, we've sanitized those stories quite a bit in American culture, but their origins, which I think is what Into the Woods is looking at more, has a lot to do with coming of age and fear and dealing with fear, and we talk about like courage in those stories, but it's not just about defeating a dragon, it's just about dealing with life so often.
Yeah, a lot of those fairy tales are very intense and dark, and certainly I think, or maybe in some cases are maybe more realistic than the way the American culture has dulled them down in terms of confronting realities of what it means to be alive and to be a person who is fertile in this world, and what that means for a person who is of childbearing age. So certainly, and I think that's interesting. I think it's so interesting how American culture has sort of twisted that and turned it into this like fairy princess kind of, and princess mania is a real thing when you have a young child. And my daughter always really pushed back on it and was really never interested in it. Certainly, I think that's probably partially my influence, right? Avoiding it as much as possible. But it's very much a thing, and it's so fascinating to me that we sort of glorify these princesses when they have this weird dark history. And I like that you brought up the red. I mean, red is a color that I cannot get away from in my work. If you look deeply, most of the pieces have some sort of pink or red, in them. And certainly that is a reference to red is just such a feminine color. You think about childbirth, you think about fertility. So that is just unavoidable for me because it really is a lot of what the work is about.
Well, I also, when I look at the work, there's something, and this is what I was mentioning earlier about how I see other work that sort of takes this approach. the sort of history, when you think about textiles, you think about weaving and sewing, and there's like pattern and structure to things, and the way a quilt is done. It's easy to put sort of a geometric sort of quality to textile work. Yeah, a lot of the work I see from you is it's either very fluid, or it's sort of an explosion of maybe that's not quite the word, but a lot of color and texture. I
Mhm.
mean, some of those smaller pieces you're talking about, like in the wooden background, the wooden frames, I know I'm gonna want to touch them so badly when I'm in the room with them. You just want to reach out and touch them because they look like they're so much fun, so soft, so comforting in a
Yeah.
way. Yet they also break away from, I mean, I know that they were probably constructed with great precision and everything, but the impact is much more organic than that geometric foundation would
Yeah.
suggest.
I love that you said that. I think, historically textiles they have this sort of this XY axis, or this
Mhm.
grid sort of perspective. And that is, logistically, because that's how warp and a weft is how you create a weaving. And I like the conceptual meaning behind that as well. I love this idea of a structured sort of process to produce something that is functional, like a quilt or a weaving. And I'm really fascinated with how, even though that is very much a linear sort of angled perspective, a lot of the history of textiles within contemporary art is very organic. And I like that so much of making textiles is of the body physically. Like, it's a very physical thing to do to make textiles. My students in my textile classes always complain about, like, wow, making textiles is a lot more work than I thought it was going to be on my body. And it is. So I think I'm really intrigued by then creating work that reflects the body. So organic just naturally lends itself to the body. So I want to make that connection. So even though the work might start off on this sort of XY axis, and very process based, I want it to get to a place where it arrives at being formal of the body, and suggestive. I don't want it to be super clear. I don't want you to look at it and be like, well, that looks like a woman's figure. I want it to be sort of open-ended in that way. I want you to be able to see whatever you want to see within the works themselves. But that's important to me because, it all comes back to the body and our body's experience within space, and the fragility of the body and sort of our experiences with one another. So certainly that's important to me. But another thing that's really been of interest lately is this history of embellishment of textiles, this idea of this sort of ornate perspective on creating work that is textured, that is sort of attractive to the viewer's mind's eye. Immediately when we see something that is highly embellished, we want to touch it. We want to have that physical experience. And anytime I show my works, there's always issues with people wanting to touch them, which normally I'm like, you see a little kid walk in there and it's fine, whatever. But it's amazing how many people don't care. They'll just go right up and grab it and try to touch it. I love that visceral reaction that it creates, that it makes you want to sort of become of it and to sort of think about your body in relationship with the piece. And that's why scale is also really important to me. I like these smaller scale pieces because they are intimate and that they draw you in. But the larger scale pieces force you to think about your body and its relationship with the piece as well. So then that's another level of relationship that comes into the work that is, just as important as all of that sort of historical context that I was talking about with textiles. It's just a physical thing. It's very much of, we can touch this, we can feel this, we can think about, textiles, we wear them on our body every day. They are very personal. They keep us warm. They keep us feeling safe. So we can all have some sort of connection to them. And that's why I'm just so drawn to soft materials, generally, is because of that.
Well, some of the sculptures, when you talk about kids, they look like you could pull them off the wall and carry them around like a doll and sleep with them. And, it's, I think about Raggedy Ann, which of course is a very specific sort of form, but your stuff is not that. But we think about the hair for the Raggedy Ann doll and the way those textures and things work with the Raggedy Ann doll.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the appeal, right? You just want to grab it and you just want to, like, I don't just want to grab it. I want to put it against my face and I
Mhm.
want to hold it
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a, like a, like my favorite blanket or whatever, you know.
Of course, yeah, and I've been hiding dolls in the pieces. Actually, one of the pieces in Wheelhouse, well, two of the pieces have doll parts, soft dolls, like cloth dolls, sewn and embedded into the pieces themselves. So quite literally, you know, that is also of importance of this sort of association that we have with comfort. And academically, I've done a lot of research and presentations at different conferences about sort of how art for artists is very much a comfort. It's like a coping skill for anxiety, whereas a child might have a blanket that might be their sort of comfort item. That artists tend to, when we make things, we tend to, that process itself is very much of comfort, and sort of our grown-up way of finding something that brings us to like coping skill, which is certainly was needed during the pandemic, right? So I think they became more and more embellished because I was needing that. I was needing to feel a sense of control. And still, even lately, I certainly feel that way as well. So it all kind of comes around to that, to the material and the process as well.
Well, and you're also making me think about, you mentioned earlier about textile work, fiber arts being so gendered. But you also the way you talk about the relationship to the body and the organic forms, there are ways in which it starts to make me think like, is it more difficult for men? And again, this is an extremely broad swipe, but to have that sort of relationship with the textile mediums, is there something that's more inherent in women, or female personalities, that they make that connection in a way that is that harder for men? Or is that really just about how society has placed us?
I think it's more of how society has placed us. I think it relates to, the tradition of craft and the tradition of looking at how certain mediums were gendered. So the work and sort of my motivations behind it are to push on that gender role, that idea that textiles was of the feminine, and that sort of was the natural way it should have been, versus the fact that, no, that was sort of just what women were allotted, as their process. And therefore, that's how it, turned into, even today, a lot more of textile and fiber artists are women. But certainly, I think that we should question that, and we should say, why is it so? It's still very much in the contemporary art world. For me to call myself a fiber artist, some people cringe at that. That a lot of people that work with textiles don't want to be called a fiber artist, and that comes from this kind of gross history we have with craft, where we just don't take the medium seriously. But there's plenty of what I would sort of consider cis male artists who are working with textiles that are creating just as strong work that is talking about associations of gender. I lost my video here. Associations of gender and sort of this sort of context behind it. But yeah, I think just like where I was talking about the nuclear family, that very much is a construct, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? It doesn't mean that we don't associate textiles with the feminine. So certainly it's there. So we should definitely talk about it, and we should sort of try to question it. And that's why I use the materials, because I like that. I like to be able to bring up those notions of it being, and I don't want to disregard the fact that it was for a very long time a woman dominated field, and we should definitely, that's important. That history is very important. So like everything with my work, I feel like it's more of just an exploration than less of like a sort of critical review. But I would, if I had to say it, it certainly is just sort of the way that our society has approached it.
Well, from my perspective as a white cis male of a certain age, I'm 61. So, I can't help but think like there's an arrogance to men in American society, and perhaps all over the world, but I'll just keep it to American society of a certain time and period, that that to not be open to not be open to even a good understanding of one's own physical self in a way that women do through different experiences. I mean, it's, I've always like, men don't go through menstruation and men don't give birth to children. And I think there's a way in which men have seen themselves as being sort of indomitable.
Yeah.
And sort of, and that, so that's what I'm wondering. And I'm not
Yeah,
find
no,
it.
that way of looking at
Yeah.
it makes much more sense to me. And certainly I would definitely agree with that. I would certainly see that how textiles being the way that they are, being that they are often of the body, whether that be the physical creation of them or their suggestive sort of forms of them, the softness, the femininity around it,
Right. And
can lend
masculinity
itself better to it could lend itself better to
built
like
into
a
the
person
architecture.
who is of the body, whereas a male might not necessarily have that experience, or may not be sort of in a role where they necessarily get that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's where I was kind of going. I mean, it's like I agree with you completely. I don't want to pigeonhole uh, um, uh, people working with textile or fiber as you know, we're always going to see women, even it is predominantly women, but we're in a place now as a society where a lot of change is happening. So we do see more and more people. I remember taking a class when I was in school and I was studying painting, and I took a class with Lyda Gordon, who who we've unfortunately lost, but who was a terrific instructor and an important fiber artist. And you know, I remember coming out of there, and there was nothing of my finished work that I felt good about. But what I realized was, and it was maybe the first time I realized this, was that that was exactly what was valuable about it, was that it was sort of breaking down my preconceptions and my expectations of myself as an artist.
Yeah.
That you know, it was like, and you know, just to put it at the sort of the most sort of, you know, maybe juvenile level, it's kind of like, oh, you think it's so easy, you went in there and you weren't happy with anything you did, it's a lot harder than you think, isn't it? But you know, I found great value in that class and that experience with her, even though I didn't produce good objects to art for myself, because I think it did break my thinking up a little bit.
Yeah, and going back to sort of that gender conversation, I think about the students in my classes, you know, in my fiber material studies. I'm thinking of one student in particular. He was this student who came in and he was like, I'm a painter and I came to art school to be a painter, you know, and he had this very like preconceived notion of what it was, you know, to be an artist. And then he took the textiles class and he just fell in love with the medium. I mean, and you know, I would sort of consider him very masculine student, very, he played basketball and he was really interested in sports, and, you know, never would have probably, you know, considered knitting as an art form, right? And, you know, by the end of the semester, he was knitting around basketballs and he was creating this really great installation work. And it just sort of showed the transformation of how, and he was talking, and he ended up making work that was talking about masculinity in sports. And he was like sort of pushing back a little bit on that. And it ended up being this really beautiful, really wonderful work. And that definitely goes back to sort of the conversation we were just having about sort of our associations. And I think it's really great when we're able to use that sort of either baggage or just a sort of associations that we have with textiles to make these sort of connections and to make art that does push back, but also just questions it and explores it.
I can immediately see the complete sense of a basketball and knitting, because a basketball at its peak moment of accomplishment, right? It's going through a net that is a sort of a loose woven thing. There's a very obvious relationship that is there all the time in that game.
Yeah, no, there's actually quite a few textile artists who have created art around the net of a basketball hoop. There's one that's covers them with beads. There's others that have made like, you know, different materials out of the net. So I love that we can have these conversations, and that the sort of gendered connection of textiles allows us to do that. And that's why I think I'm just so drawn to it, because it forces us to just rethink sort of what we consider and what we associate with different roles that we might find ourselves, whether we want to be part of or whether we were just sort of conditioned to be part of.
Well, and I can't help but think, and of course, this is just, we're in the middle of this conversation, so it's convincing to me that the world of fiber arts is, out of all the mediums, the one that is best equipped to do this.
Absolutely. Just naturally through the material itself and the process itself. It just makes a lot of sense. And it's also very universal. You know, I think, like I was saying before, how, you know, we all wear clothing, we all have this personal connection, and throughout the world, it's not just American culture, you know, there's cultures all over the world that have that personal connection. And there's just so much meaning that comes with that history.
Well, and I've been calling it fiber arts, textile arts, but I do want to just remind people that you describe yourself as multidisciplinary, and I'm assuming that's in part to not to help avoid that pigeonhole, right? That people have this assumption about you if you say you're a fiber artist.
Yeah, and I have no problem. Like, I call myself a fiber artist all the time, but I see myself as multidisciplinary. And I think that's more because my background came from sculpture and installation. So I see myself, as a sculptor. I see myself as a fiber artist. So that more like interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary label makes more sense for me. I've also tried really hard to branch out in terms of my materials, to not just stick to fiber art. So I think if I give myself that label mentally, then I take the pressure off, and allow myself to really bring in any sort of material that I want. But I always, joke about, I teach this fiber class at UK occasionally, and it's called Fiber and Material Studies, because really that's what fiber art is. It's material studies. And then if you, broaden that, that's what all artists are doing. We are studying material, we are breaking it down. A lot of sculptors, particularly, material is just so important to the work itself. So yeah, I think having that more broader label just gives me room to be able to play.
Well, and I think that phrase multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. I mean, it seems like we're at a period for the last 20 years or more of really erasing some of these, or if not erasing them, at least sort of breaking down the divisions and the descriptions. So it's getting harder and harder to find somebody who simply describes themselves as a painter or a sculptor. And even then it's like, well, what mediums are you using? And then what mediums are you using this year? Versus what you 2 years ago.
Or within one show, or within one exhibition, for sure. Or within
one show. I mean, and I know artists that bounce back and forth, they do different things. And it's also just a very sort of practical approach professionally, right? If you want to sell work, if you want to be represented in different places, you can't just be making one kind of thing that only fits in one kind of space and one kind of idea, and artists are naturally restless, I think.
Yes.
And it's
yes.
just the nature.
I think that's key to that conversation. And we talk about this a lot in academia. I teach at a community college, and I'm always talking to other professors across the country who are teaching within my field, which is like art foundations, like introductory art classes. And there's like just too many silos within sort of the way we teach art too, right? Like you take a painting class and in drawing. And I think it's very important that we teach technical skills. So don't get me wrong. But I think the trend is to make things a little bit more gray, to allow a little bit of overlap within the way we teach, so that so when students are coming out of art school, they can take more of that interdisciplinary approach and be skilled in different things, right? Because it's a shame that if you go to art school and you just learn one skill, that, hey, down the line, you might really want to learn this skill. My undergrad, I was making terrible welded metal sculptures, and that's all I learned. I didn't even do textiles till I went to grad school. And I would have really liked to. I would have really liked to have a little bit more technical skill in the soft arts. So certainly we got to kind of mix things up a little bit, I think, when it comes to the way that we approach that perspective.
Well, does your daughter work with you? Does she come in the studio, and does she ever participate in your process? Or she
Well, she's sort of rebelling right now. She's really not into art right now because, her mom's an artist, so that doesn't interest her. But yeah, certainly having a studio at home, I'm sitting in my studio right now, which is connected to my living room. And it's important to me that my studio is at home because it makes itself sort of really easy to just sort of pick up stuff. And so that she can, sort of mosey her way in. She's so used to it. It's just such a day-to-day to her just to have these random things like hanging on the walls that to her, it's just like, oh, here's this weird thing, that mom's working on. She has comments for sure about what they are and what she thinks things look like. Typically it's like an animal, like her associations are always with animals. But she likes to draw. So she'll sit in here and do a lot of drawing. But otherwise she's like wants to be a scientist or something very different than what I do. But the other reason why I make the work I make is very much logistical. I am a full-time mom, I'm a full-time professor. I don't have as much time to devote to the studio, and working with textiles lends itself really easy to that because you can be sewing on something, put it down, come back to it, right? It's not like painting where you're thinking about your stages or drying or that kind of thing. It's very portable. I often, even though I have a studio, I often am working on the couch. That's where I get most of my work done, or I can take it somewhere else. So when you're, a parent, that's really useful and really helpful because you're often distracted. It's not unusual for like you to get started on something and then someone needs something,
Right.
So I do love that about it. I love the portable nature of it, and it allows you, and it's mindless sometimes, and sometimes you need mindless, right? Because, if you're overwhelmed and you're thinking about all your other tasks, it's really nice just to be able to kind of like come and sew on something. And I'm just sewing red beads on a surface, I'm not having to overcomplicate things. And that's very therapeutic. It feels really good to be able to just zone out. So yeah.
That's a very common observation when I've talked to textile artists or some other kinds of processes, but textile artists in particular, that there is a therapeutic, or they can kind of zen out. There's a way in which it helps them relax, but they're also accomplishing something.
Yes.
So there's that.
It's extremely satisfying to be able to mindlessly work on something and then sort of pull back from it and be like, oh, wow, look how much, I accomplished. That's why I love embroidery. And I end up doing a lot of embroidery on my surfaces because there is something very rewarding about the process. So yeah, you do have to check in intellectually, right, where you plan something. But I would say most of my work is very intuitive. I'm not the type of artist that sketches in a sketchbook. And plans a sculpture or plans a piece. I can't, that's impossible for me. I'm much more of a collage artist in that I get all the pieces. I usually put them in colors. Like I'll put a pile of red things and a pile of blue things. And then I just sort of collage them together and I pin and I stitch. It's all hand stitched. And I kind of just go with it. I try not to overthink it, because if I overthink it, it ruins it, and it just turns out to be like kind of just not appealing. And I like that. I like to work intuitively in that way, because to me, that's much more rewarding. It just feels really good to just sort of see what happens. And sometimes it's terrible. Sometimes it doesn't work out. But most of the time it's sort of like, okay. And I do a lot of cutting. So like I'll start a piece and I'll be excited about it, but then it'll take a turn and I'm just like, ooh. So I'll set it aside and then I'll come back to it 6 months later and I'll cut it out and I'll put it in a new piece. And it was funny, like Daniel was joking so I was in a show that he curated, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago. And he was like, oh, you should have that piece at the gallery. We love that piece. And I was like, oh, that's been cut up and put into another piece by now, but we can put that piece in the show. And I love that. I love that. Textiles lets you do that. It allows you to, you can just randomly cut something up and sew it back together again.
Wow. Well, I feel like I could just keep talking to you a long time now, because now we're talking about the preciousness or lack of preciousness that artists feel for their work, which I think is a whole nother interesting topic. Like I encountered with glass artists one time where they would just pick up $10,000 pieces and throw them under their arm, take them out to the car. And I'm like, ah.
I get that. Yeah.
I'm a glass artist, man. When stuff breaks, we just expect it to happen. So, but Colleen, thank you so much for talking with me today. And let's just remind people before we sign off here that your show Day In and Day Out will open at Wheelhouse Art in Louisville. That's down on Frankfurt Avenue. If people don't know, let's just spell it out. There used to be called B. Deemer, and wonderful fellow named Daniel Falsgraf, who once worked for B. Deemer, bought it out and has established his own gallery, which it seems to be doing very well there. Wheelhouse Art on Frankfurt Avenue, Saturday, July 16th, with the reception from 3 to 5 p.m. And I think you're probably going to do a little talk or something that day.
There'll be an informal sort of talk at 4 p.m. on that night. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. And the show's up through September 3rd. So it's got a good long run. But Colleen Merrill, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you, Keith. I so enjoyed talking with you and appreciate you inviting me to be part of this interview.
It was fun.
All right, great. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.